All right, welcome to Block 8. This is the fourth set of notes, the collapse of the two-party system. And for collapse of two-party system, we need to start kind of with the most important American politician of the 1850s, although he never became president. Number one, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas had taken over for Senator Henry Clay as the Senate's most forceful proponent of union. He was a union man. He thought that the United States had a lot more to worry about than slavery. He was an expansionist and a pro internal improvements. He was almost a Whig in that regard. He was a Democrat, but he was not necessarily a Jacksonian Democrat. Along with Clay, number one, it was Stephen Douglas that helped guide the Compromise of 1850 through the Senate. He was a short man, about 5'5" and stocky and well-built. He was known as the Little Giant because he was small, but he had very intelligent and forceful opinions, forcefully presented. He was an excellent speaker. He was Jacksonian in the sense that he was a man of the people, but he was also very well educated and well spoken. And if you had asked anybody in 1850 what Stephen Douglas's future held, they all would have said to a man that man, Stephen Douglas, would one day become president. His political philosophy, he believed in expansion, he believed in manifest destiny. He had been one of those people willing to fight for all of Oregon, 54-40 or fight. He was a 100% supporter of the Mexican War. And what else made him a Jacksonian in a sense, he believed in the people. He trusted the people. And he believed that all major ideas should be dealt with on what he called popular sovereignty. All right, and this is an idea that we've talked about. This idea goes through the 1850s, popular sovereignty. Again, number one, the idea that the citizens of an area should decide directly on what kind of society that area was going to have. To Douglas, nothing on earth was more axiomatically democratic. That to him, this was obvious. That in a democracy, the people rule, and the type of society that the people have should be decided on by those people. He looked at the debate over slavery in the territories and said, this is a foolish debate, because all of those territories out west that we looked at in the last set of notes, slavery would never flourish in those areas like it flourished in the South. So to have slavery out there, Douglas, it's not even worth arguing about. The United States has lots of other interesting things that it can be debating and doing than arguing over slavery in the territories. Now, he was Whiggish and a Hamiltonian in the sense that he believed in economic expansion, railroads, canals, etc. God bless you. Etc., etc., etc. God bless you. All right, so the election of 1852 for president. Both the Democrats and the Whigs supported the Compromise of 1850, so the election turned more on party discipline. The Democrats passed over James Buchanan, who was a diplomat, Lewis Cass, and they passed over Stephen Douglas, because the three of them all kind of knocked each other out of the running. That, you know, Douglas was unacceptable to Buchanan, Buchanan was unacceptable to Cass, Cass was unacceptable to both, so they kind of had to look around for another candidate. So they nominated a dark horse. That's Stephen Douglas, here he is, and they nominated a dark horse, Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was a Democrat from New Hampshire. He was known as a doughboy. A doughface, excuse me, doughboy is something else. A doughface. A doughface was a northern pro-slavery Democrat. So here's Pierce. He was acceptable to both sections of the Democratic Party. The northern section, because he was from the north, and he believed in, you know, to a degree of railroads and internal improvements. And he was acceptable to the South because he was pro-slavery. He believed that slavery was a fundamental right, and that it should be able to be spread into the territories. The Whigs, on the other hand, were splintering. The Whigs were starting to fall apart. And because the sectionalism that was going on. Northern Whigs were becoming more anti-slavery, like everyone was in the North. This anti-slavery in the North drove Southern Whigs into the Democratic Party. Now, the Northern Whigs and the Southern Whigs both have a name. The Northern Whigs, we're going to see that a little later, are called the Conscience Whigs, and the Southern Whigs, right here, are sometimes known as the Cotton Whigs. So you have the Conscience Whigs and the Cotton Whigs. Conscience in the north, Cotton obviously in the south. Northern Whigs are split over slavery. That the Whig Party, which had grown as an anti-Jackson movement, was now starting to split on the issue of slavery. Say hello. Say hello. Say hello. Yeah. You can sit here and be cute. Alright. Due to the weakness of the Whigs and the fact that the Whig Party was splintering, more than the strength of Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce, there was nothing to write home about Franklin Pierce. The Democrats won the election, and importantly, pro-slavery pro-slavery congressmen won control of Congress. So there, you see the map. The Whigs nominated General Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican, the hero of the Mexican War. Do you see yourself? Mm-hmm. The Whigs nominated General Scott, the hero of the Mexican War, but because the party was splintering, Winfield Scott could not really hold up against the Democrats. And you see the map that Winfield Scott won, you know, Kentucky and Tennessee and some New England states, but Franklin Pierce really kind of swept the election of 1852. So it shows that in 1852 the Whig Party was split and the Democrats were still strong, but many Northern Democrats were starting to have second thoughts about where the pro-slavery Southern Democrats were taking the party. So Franklin Pierce comes into the White House in March of 1853. He surrounds himself with really, really good advisors from all different parts of the country. And a lot of people were pinning high hopes on President Pierce. But an administration of that much talent needs a strong leader at its head, and Franklin Pierce was not a strong leader. Franklin Pierce has a very interesting personal story, and this is not necessarily in your notes. Franklin Pierce had a drinking problem. And he was in Congress, and the drinking problem kind of got the best of him. So he resigned from Congress, went home, and said, I'm going to beat my drinking problem, and he did. He came back to Washington. He served in the Mexican War. He did not serve particularly gloriously in the Mexican War. There was an incident where his horse, I guess, tripped, and he fell off of his horse, and all of his opponents started whispering that he was drinking again, and he can't even stay on a horse, you know? And when he ran against Winfield Scott in the election of 1852, who was a real military hero, a lot of the Whigs looked at Pierce and said, he's the hero of many a bottle. Really? You like that? Okay. All right, letter B in Pierce's administration is the Gadsden Purchase. You want to hang up here? In 1853, James Gadsden, the American ambassador to Mexico, purchased 29,000 square miles of land in what is today southern Arizona and southern New Mexico to build a railroad. And this is very mountainous here. This section of North America, right through the Gadsden Purchase, was a lot flatter. So this land is where the United States wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, a railroad from the east across the new territories into California. The Gadsden Purchase finished up the continental expansion of the United States. That starting, and you go back, it was purchased in 1853. In 1607, you know, a couple settlers landed on Virginia's coast, and within 250 years, the country that they had kind of stimulated was now complete from Atlantic to Pacific. So that's letter B, the Gadsden Purchase, this completed American territorial expansion. And now we're going to get back into what really started to split the country apart. Letter C, Kansas and Nebraska. All right, let's have a look at the map. Settlers were beginning to move from the land west of Missouri and Iowa into this big yellow territory. And it was called the Nebraska Territory. Now, Senator Douglas, Stephen Douglas, is the chair of the Committee on Territories. He said totally normally did not think this was going to blow up in anybody's face. He said, all right, we're going to formally name this a territory. We're going to set up a territorial government. We're going to get Nebraska on its way to being, you know, divided up into states. Everyone goes home happy. Douglas is an expansionist. He wants this territory organized because he wants to run a railroad from the east to the west through Kansas or through Nebraska. Why did he want to run a railroad? Well, he was an expansionist and he was also an investor in this railroad. So this territory was called the Nebraska Territory. The whole thing was called the Nebraska Territory. And Senator Douglas, in a regular day in Congress, started the procedure to make it a formal territory. Now, Douglas would have supported both railway lines, the one through where the Gadsden Purchase was and this one, but Congress, controlled by Jacksonian Southern Democrats, would have been hard-pressed to authorize one railroad, let alone 2 or 3 or 4, like Douglas would have wanted. So, when Douglas goes to organize this territory, Southern senators say, whoa, hold up. Absolutely not. Now, they have 2 reasons. One, they don't want the railroad running through the north. But in reality, the real issue here is slavery. If you remember, here's the Missouri Compromise line. The Missouri Compromise line says no slavery north of the Missouri Compromise, except in the state of Missouri. And Southerners look at Nebraska Territory and say, oh my God, how many new free states is that going to be? We are going to be, it's bad enough that California was admitted to the Union and the balance was off by 1, but how many new states will be formed out of this Nebraska Territory? And Southerners in Congress refuse to authorize the new territory. And they force Senator Douglas to the negotiating table. Senator Douglas is not interested in slavery. Senator Douglas is interested in expansion and railroads and Hamiltonianism. So he compromises without much of a problem. The Southerners forced Douglas to negotiate a deal. Oh, don't move that pool. And Douglas does. And he comes up with, number 4, what's known as the KansasNebraska Act. And the KansasNebraska Act divides the territory into 2. The Kansas Territory down here in the south, and the Nebraska Territory running up to the Canadian border. And then the Missouri Compromise on slavery is repealed. The idea that this line represented the southern border, or excuse me, the northern border of slavery, that was out. And in Kansas and in Nebraska, the issue of slavery would be decided on the idea of popular sovereignty. That meant that the status of both territories, free and slave, would be decided by the voters. Go play with your toys, Charlotte. Now, Stephen Douglas wants to run for... So popular sovereignty in the territories, Missouri Compromise is repealed. Douglas is trying to set himself up to run for president in 1856, and he has no problem compromising because he needs Southern support. Now, he counted on Southerners supporting him because slavery can now enter into these new territories. It technically allowed slavery here, but Douglas looks at these territories and says, look, slavery is never going to thrive there, so even if there's a few slaves here and there, they're going to be largely free anyway. He counted on the North accepting this compromise, this KansasNebraska Act, because slavery would never thrive here. He said to the North, look, free labor and free farmers are going to be the people that move into this territory anyway. It's not fit for slavery. And then Douglas said, look, it's popular sovereignty. There's going to be a lot more free people than slave owners, so they can just vote to eliminate slavery. Douglas thinks that this is a nice, easy schmeezy, take care of the problem, way to go. He completely miscalculates. and the North gets really pissed off. And you can see from the cartoon in your notes, Northerners saw the Kansas-Nebraska Act as shoving slavery down the throat of a free soil person. Because by 1854, everything that had been leading up to it, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Fugitive Slave Act, had made the North more anti-slavery than it had ever been before. Now, number one, most Northerners were willing to accept slavery below the old Missouri Compromise line. Thank you, Charlotte. They were willing to accept, they didn't like it necessarily, but it was already down there. That was an old compromise. Everyone respected it. Slavery below 3630, fine, many Northerners said. Most Northerners said. But they were to open land north of it. Land that had been promised to be free for 30 years created a huge backlash in the North. And they started referring to the South as the slave power. Open lands north of it to slavery, it seemed to Northerners that the slave power's tentacles were increasing. That the slave power was down here and now they were marching their little tentacles across the country. And the tentacles of the slave power were ever increasing. The opposition and the anger in the North were unlike anything that had been seen since the Revolutionary era. People wrote letters, went to meetings, went to societies. How can we stop this Kansas-Nebraska Act? Everyone writes to their, their representatives. Don't pass this bill, don't pass this bill. But since Democrats control Congress and the Southerners control the Democratic Party, there was nothing the North could do. Southerners in both parties in Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it became law. And Northerners were highly insulted that the slave power was growing. Now, of course, the South saw this as protecting themselves from the much more powerful North. The North saw it as this slave power increasing its evilness across the country. 2 days after the act passed, the case of Anthony Burns, which we talked about in the last set of notes, took place. And these two things, Burns plus Kansas-Nebraska Act, radicalized many Northerners and made them turn towards abolitionism. And that was the situation by, 1852, that was the situation by 1854. The election, the off-year election of 1854. Congressional elections are held every 2 years. There was no presidential election in 1854, but there was congressional elections, and the two-party system by then had changed. So let's do a little review. The party system changes. In 1850, at the end of the Mexican War, when the Compromise of 1850 went down, there was two parties. You had the Whigs. The Whigs were powerful in the North and common in the South. The conscience Whigs and cotton Whigs coexisted. They didn't particularly exist harmoniously, but they existed. They coexisted because slavery was not the most important issue. And then, of course, you had the Democrats, the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian Democrats. They were the most popular party in America. There was Northern Democrats, there was Southern Democrats. Slavery was one issue, but it was not the most important issue. It did not define most people's politics. Only about 10% of Northerners were strong abolitionists, and that's not enough people to make a political party out of. Most people saw slavery as one of many issues, and people did not vote straight up on slavery, and that allowed both parties to exist in both parts of the country. Southern Whigs didn't like slavery, but they were Whigs for other reasons. Northern Democrats didn't like slavery, but they were Democrats for other reasons. Okay? That slavery was not the most important issue. But the events from 1850 to 1854 took slavery. Oh, thank you. Are you my assistant? Do you want to be an assistant? Can you give me my marker? Can I have my marker, please? Thank you. You want to sit up on Dada's lap? Okay. But by 1854, slavery was the most important. There you are. Slavery was the most important issue, so the parties changed. By 1854, number one, the Whigs had virtually ceased to exist. The Cotton Whigs in the South had become Democrats, and the Northern Whigs no longer responded to the new concerns of Northern voters. Now, Northern voters had two major concerns by 1854, and they were not the concerns that the Whig Party had been created to address. The two most important concerns for Northern voters in 1854 were number one, immigration, and number two, slavery. And the Whigs really didn't have much to say about either, so people went to different parties. And the first of those was a party that we already saw in our lecture about the North and the South. Number two, the American Party, which is known to history as the Know-Nothing Party. As we said earlier, many Americans were worried about Irish immigration. They flocked to this new American Party, which was, in the North, anti-slavery. Now, many Southerners, especially in southern towns and the few southern cities, were also worried about the Irish, because the Irish were coming to the South also, joined this party. Now, in the North, so their main thing, the American Party's main platform is careful about immigration. We want to restrict immigration. We want to make it more difficult to become a citizen. We want to make sure that, you know, we keep those dirty Catholic Irish out, is the main idea of the American Party. Northerners joined it in the North. Southerners joined it in the South. And in the North, the American Party, when asked, was anti-slavery, and in the South, the American Party, when anyone asked, was pro-slavery. But that was not their main issue. Immigration was. Now, obviously, the American Party would have a very difficult time running a national campaign, because if one person's going to represent the American Party, how do you juxtapose Northern Know-Nothings being anti-slavery and Southern Know-Nothings being pro-slavery? But it was very successful on the local level, and in the election of 1854, it elected over 40 congressmen, went to Congress, went to Washington as members of the American Party. So the Whigs are gone. The American Party is addressing concerns about immigration. Now, the Democrats in 1854. Northern anti-slavery Democrats had left the party because the Democrats were now being dominated by the South. In 1852, there was 91 congressional Free State Democrats. 2 years later, over 60 of them had lost their elections. And in 1854, only 25 Democrats from free states are sitting in Congress. And that made the southern wing of the Democrats less likely to compromise. That the southern wing of the Democratic Party began to represent extreme states' writers and slave-holding Southerners only. Okay, so that's how the Democratic Party changed. The Democrat Party lost most of its free state support. It became a... Ooh, be careful, Pook. It became a Southern party. And then in 1854, you had the rise, the beginning, of what would become the second, currently, is the second great American political party. Yes. It fell. The Republican Party, number two, the Republican Party. The Republican Party is purely a sectional party. It had no support in the South, and it did not try to get support in the South. It was made up of four different groups. Abolitionists, those for whom slavery had been always the biggest issue. Abolitionists found a home in the Republican Party. They did not dominate the Republican Party, but they found a home there. Number two, the most free soilers, people who believe that slavery should not spread into the territories, that the territories should be for free labor only. So abolitionists, free soilers, conscience Whigs. So all of those Whigs that, you know, were pro-internal improvements and railroads and canals and banks and all those who could not accept slavery, conscience Whigs joined the Republican Party, and Democrats in the North who were against the KansasNebraska Act. Those four groups combine, and very soon, by 1854, the Republican Party is a major factor in the North. In the North, by 1854, the Whigs are gone, the Democrats are weakened, and Republicans and Americans, the American Party and the Republican Party, are competing for those votes. And they compete very successfully. That the Congress of 1854 had a lot fewer Northern Democrats, a lot more know-nothings, and the first dozens or so Republicans in the country. And that brings us to the election of 1856, the presidential election. The American Party has a lot of trouble because they are, the biggest issue is slavery in the country, and the Northern know-nothings are anti-slavery, the Southern know-nothings are pro-slavery, but since know-nothingism is more powerful in the North, the Northern know-nothings kind of win the nomination battle, and they nominate Millard Fillmore, that had been president when Zachary Taylor died. Number one, letter A, the American Party. Number one, Millard Fillmore is nominated by the know-nothings. Southern know-nothings abandon the American Party for the Democrats. The Republican Party nominates its first ever presidential candidate, and there's a picture of him in your notes, John C. Fremont, the hero of the conquest of California. Fremont is a typical Whig, if you will, in his nomination. He's a military hero with very little political experience. But Fremont is a lot more articulate in his positions. He very clearly and concisely explains what Republicans stand for. They stand for internal improvements, they stand for economic expansion, they stand for manifest destiny, and they stand for no slavery extending into the territories. And they come up with a very catchy little campaign slogan which really kind of shows what they believed. And they said, free soil, free speech, Fremont. And they ran Fremont as their first presidential candidate. Constantly hitting their biggest thing, no spread of slavery. They don't want to abolish slavery, they just want to prevent its spread. And then the Democrats. The Democrats have a big problem. Franklin Pierce was ineffective. They could not renominate Pierce. They could not nominate Stephen Douglas because he was so unpopular in the North after Kansas, Nebraska. They said, if we nominate Douglas, no Northerners are going to vote for us, and then we're going to hand the election to somebody else. So they looked around and they settled on James Buchanan. He was a doughface, a Northern Democrat, and his biggest attribute, that for the last 4 years, when everyone in the country had been yelling and screaming about slavery, he had been in Europe as a diplomat. His biggest attribute was he hadn't even been in the country for the last 4 years. The Democratic Party was so split on the issue of slavery that they had to nominate someone that had not had to voice an opinion on the matter the last 4 years. So James Buchanan, the only bachelor in the history of the presidency, got the nomination. Democrats endorse Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty in the territories, and they run there. So we have two major parties here. The Know-Nothing Party is running. Okay. Republicans, no expansion of slavery in the territories. The Democrats, popular sovereignty in the territories. And the Democrats hope to obviously win the South and just hold on in the North. They portray the Republican Party as a purely sectional party, which is true. There were no Republicans in the South. And they also said that Republicans wanted to destroy the Union over slavery. Not true. And they said that the Republican Party was made up of all abolitionists who, loved black people and wanted to give them equal rights, and they would destroy slavery. And that was not true either. The Republican Party is a party that stands against the spread of slavery, and we need to understand that difference. They are not abolitionists. They are not people who believe in racial equality. That Republicans of 1856 and 1860 believe only that slavery was evil and it should not spread. They did not seek to change it as a party where it already existed. So the results. Buchanan only wins a plurality of the total votes, but he ekes out close victories in the border states between North and South. And that's enough to get him over the top electorally. Buchanan wins 174 electoral votes, Fremont 114, and Fillmore for the American Party wins 8. And if you look at the map, look at the obvious sectional differences. That the North, all the states in the extreme North voted Republican. All of the states in the extreme South voted Democrat, and it was those couple border states, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Virginia, Pennsylvania, that still went Democrat. Went Democrat really close, but they still went Democrat, which allowed Buchanan to win the election. He will be the last Democrat to win a presidential election for 7 elections, for 28 years. He is going to be the last Democrat elected to the presidency. The sectional differences are clear. The sectional differences are growing. The North and the South are no longer speaking the same language. The political parties of the last 30 years have split. And all that the country was waiting for now was to see what would happen next. Would the argument move from words and insults and argument into physical violence? And after the election of 1856, physical violence was right around the corner. You want to come say goodbye, Charlotte? Come here, Pook. Come here. You want to say bye-bye? Say bye-bye. Can you say bye-bye? Can you give Dad a kiss? Can you give the camera a kiss? Give the camera a big kiss. Yeah. Smooch!